Millstone Hill, Vermont, August 1887. The air was thick with the dust of 1,000 cuts, a fine white powder that settled on the wild blueberries and dulled the green of the spruce. All day, the hill rang with the clamor of industry, the rhythmic clang of hammer on steel, the groan of derricks, the sharp crack of splitting granite. But on the northern slope, away from the main quarry pits, a different sound echoed, a solitary and peculiar rhythm. Tink, tink, tink. It was the sound of one man, Jago Trevenna, driving a hand steel into the flank of a 40-foot granite boulder, a glacial erratic the size of a small chapel, left behind by the ice 10,000 years before. The other quarrymen, on their way to the pay shed, would stop and watch. They saw a man attacking a mountain with a teaspoon. Augustus Daly, the granite yard foreman, a man whose eye could measure a stone block to the quarter-inch from 20 paces, shook his head. He stood with Silas Croft, a carpenter, and Jedediah Stone, a teamster whose oxen hauled the finished blocks down to the railhead. "It's madness," Daly said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who understood the stone, or thought he did. "He's been at it a month. For what? To make a chipmunk a new parlor?" Jedediah Stone spat a brown stream of tobacco juice. "He says he's going to live in it. Hollow it out, he says." A laugh broke from Silas Croft. "Live in a rock? Without a proper frame? Without windows? The man's a fool. Come the first frost, that stone will sweat so bad his blankets will be solid ice by morning. He'll drown in his own breath." Daly's concern was more professional, more precise. He watched Trevenna carefully tamp a small black powder charge into the hole he'd spent 2 days drilling. "It's not the damp that'll get him," Daly stated, his voice low and certain. "It's the cracking. He's using powder, little shots. But they're still shots. He's introducing hairlines, thousands of them, into the core. The first good hard frost will get into those cracks with its little wedges of ice and split that boulder open like a dropped melon." The men nodded. It was common knowledge. It was the physics of their trade. The Cornishman was not just foolish. He was building his own tomb. What did this Cornish miner, a man who worked in the stone, understand about thermal mass that the men who merely cut and shaped it had missed? This story is about a different kind of knowledge, one born not in textbooks, but in the deep, dark, and dangerous places of the earth. It's a story about how a man used a mountain to defeat a winter, and how a principle of physics, ignored by convention, provided a warmth that no amount of firewood could match. If you stick with me, I promise you will learn how the immense, slow power of thermal mass works, a principle that modern builders are only now rediscovering. For now, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments, what's the coldest you've ever been, and what did you learn from it? Jago Trevenna was not a carpenter, nor a farmer, nor a frontiersman. He was a man of the lode, a tributor from the Penryn quarries in Cornwall, where his family had been breaking granite since before America was a nation. He thought not in board feet or acres, but in fathoms and cleavage planes. His hands were shaped by the 8-pound hammer and the drill steel, his eyes accustomed to reading the subtle language of the rock, the faint quartz veins that promised a clean break, the dark intrusions of basalt that warned of unpredictable shattering. He didn't build things on the land. He found what was useful within it. He had arrived in Vermont the previous autumn with his wife, Morwenna, and their 2 small children, Kenza and Piran. They came with a dozen other Cornish families, drawn by the promise of good pay for men who knew how to work the world's hardest stone. They had spent their savings on a small plot of land and a hastily built board and batten shack, the standard dwelling for newcomers. That first winter was a lesson in a cold his body had never known. The Cornish cold was a damp, clinging thing that settled in the bones. But this Vermont cold was a predator. It was sharp and dry and absolute. That winter, the tar in the bucket by the door didn't just harden. It cracked like flint when kicked. At night, Morwenna would sew by the weak light of a tallow lamp, and the brass collar studs on Jago's work shirt, hanging from a peg, would grow so cold they froze right through the cloth to the wall behind them. In the morning, the heavy iron well chain refused to fold. Jago had to carry it stiff as a pole to the wellhead and bash it against the stone surround to break its icy spine. They burned wood constantly, a raging, hungry fire that consumed a cord a week, yet the heat barely reached the corners of the single room. The warmth fled through the thin walls as quickly as it was made. Little Paran developed a cough that rattled in his chest for 3 straight months, and Kenza's chilblains were so bad she cried when Morwenna tried to pull her woolen stockings on. Jago, a quiet and methodical man, watched his family suffer and made a silent promise. Never again. He would not fight the winter on its terms. He would fight it on his. The failure of the conventional frontier cabin was not a failure of effort, but a failure of physics. The settlers of Millstone Hill were hard-working, knowledgeable people. Silas Croft could raise a cabin in a week, his joints so tight you couldn't slip a knife blade in them. But he was building with wood, and wood was the wrong weapon for this war. A standard cabin wall was 6 inches of air trapped between planks. It had an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of perhaps 5 or 6. The howling Vermont wind, finding every microscopic gap, made that number meaningless. Cold air poured in and warm air rushed out. It was a process called infiltration, and it was a relentless thief of heat. The real problem, however, was more fundamental. The problem wasn't just keeping cold out, it was about keeping heat in. A wooden structure has very little thermal mass. Imagine heating a tin plate and a cast iron skillet over a fire. The tin plate gets hot almost instantly, but the moment you pull it from the flame, it's cold again. The skillet takes longer to heat up, but once hot, it stays hot for a long, long time, radiating a steady, even warmth. A frontier cabin was a tin plate. It could only be warm when the fire was roaring. The moment the fire died down to coals, the temperature inside began to plummet, chasing the temperature outside. Families like the Crofts were locked in a constant battle. They stuffed rags in the cracks, banked snow against the foundation, and hung heavy quilts over the doorways. They fed their stoves with a desperate intensity, turning cords of maple and birch into fleeting comfort. At night, the temperature in their sleeping loft would drop below freezing, even with a fire banked below. They woke to ice crystals on their blankets and a skin of ice in the water bucket just feet from the stove. They were living inside a sieve, pouring their labor, in the form of chopped wood, into a vessel that could not hold it. Jago Trevenna understood this. He had seen it in the mines, where the deep rock held a constant cool temperature year-round, indifferent to the sun or snow on the surface. He knew that to survive the winter, he didn't need a better stove. He needed a better battery. He needed mass. All through the late summer and into the autumn, Jago worked. His methods were patient, ancient, and to the others, utterly bizarre. He didn't use the big steam drills from the quarry. He used a single jack technique, holding the drill steel in one hand, turning it slightly after each blow from the 8-pound sledge in his other. Tink, turn, tink, turn. He was listening to the stone, feeling its texture through the vibrating steel. He would drill a pattern of shallow holes, angled inward, never more than a foot deep. He read the grain of the boulder, a complex tapestry of feldspar, quartz, and mica, looking for the natural lines of weakness. Then came the powder. He used small, carefully measured charges of black powder, just enough to burst the rock, not to shatter it. He would tamp the charge with damp clay, light a long fuse, and walk a safe distance away. There was no sharp, cracking explosion that echoed across the valley. Instead, there was a deep, dull thump, a sound that seemed to be absorbed by the immense bulk of the stone. An hour later, he would crawl into the small opening he'd made, pulling out the fractured rock in baskets. He was not blasting. He was chambering. It was the same technique used for centuries in the Cornish tin mines to create underground rooms and shafts without compromising the integrity of the surrounding rock. He was carving a void, leaving a massive, continuous shell of solid granite. The opening grew slowly. First a narrow tunnel, then a small chamber, gradually expanding as he worked from the inside out. He was careful to maintain a consistent thickness, 5 feet of solid stone on every side, floor, and ceiling. He found a natural diagonal fissure running through the top of the boulder and painstakingly widened it with chisel and fire to serve as a flue for a small iron stove. He carved a single low doorway, which he would fit with a heavy plank door sealed with sheepskin. Augustus Daly, making his rounds, stopped by one afternoon in October. He peered into the dark opening, the air cool and smelling of stone dust and burnt powder. He ran his hand over the interior wall. It was rough, scalloped from the small blasts. "You've hairlined this thing, Jago," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. He wasn't being cruel. He was offering a professional warning, man to man. "I've seen it 100 times in the yard. A block looks perfect, but a few small shots have put invisible cracks in it. The first heavy frost, when the water gets in and expands, and she'll split open like a dropped melon." Jago emerged from the darkness, wiping dust from his face with the back of his hand. He looked at the foreman, his eyes calm. He was a man of few words, and he never argued. "The stone knows its own strength, Mr. Daly," he said quietly. He then picked up his hammer and steel and went back to work. Tink, turn, tink, turn. The mockery lasted through the autumn. The men in the pay shed laid bets on which day in December Trevenna's folly would split. Silas Croft declared the lack of windows an invitation to madness. "A man needs to see the sun," he'd say. "He'll go queer in that dark hole." Morwenna, when asked by the other wives if she was truly going to take her children to live in a cave, would simply smile and say, "Jago knows the stone." The mockery lasted for 3 months. The validation would last for a century. To understand what Jago Trevenna was building, you have to understand the simple, brutal physics of heat. Heat is energy, and it always moves from a place of high concentration to a place of low concentration. The fire in your stove is a concentration of heat. The 30 below zero air outside is an energy vacuum. The laws of thermodynamics demand that the heat from your stove will try to reach that vacuum as quickly as possible. A wooden wall is a poor barrier to this flow. Granite is something else entirely. The key is a property called thermal mass, or heat capacity. It's the ability of a material to absorb and store heat energy. Let's put numbers to it. Wood has a specific heat capacity of about 0.41, but its density is low, around 35 pounds per cubic foot. Granite, on the other hand, has a lower specific heat, about 0.21, but its density is immense, 165 pounds per cubic foot. When you multiply specific heat by density, you get the material's volumetric heat capacity. For wood, it's about 14. For granite, it's over 34. The stone can store more than twice the heat energy in the same amount of space. But Jago didn't have the same amount of space. He had a colossal amount. His living chamber was roughly circular, about 15 feet in diameter. Surrounding it was a shell of solid granite 5 feet thick. A quick calculation shows that the mass of that stone shell was staggering, over 450 tons. That's nearly 1,000,000 pounds of granite. That 1,000,000-pound shell was his thermal battery. Here's how it worked. During the day, Jago would run his small iron stove, not blazing hot, but at a steady, moderate burn. The heat produced, measured in British thermal units or BTUs, would warm the air in the chamber, but most of it would be slowly, steadily absorbed by the immense mass of the surrounding rock. The granite would drink in the energy. It would take hours, even days, for the innermost layer of the rock to become fully saturated with warmth. By evening, he would let the fire die down to nothing more than a few embers. In a conventional cabin, this would be the moment the cold began its assault. But in the Boulder, this was the moment the physics reversed. The air inside the chamber would begin to cool, but now it was warmer than the rock around it. The 1,000,000 pounds of granite, which had been absorbing heat all day, now began to slowly release it back into the living space. It radiated a gentle, pervasive warmth from every direction: the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It wasn't the scorching, directional heat of a stove. It was a constant, stable, ambient warmth. The Boulder had become a low-temperature radiator. It smoothed out the wild temperature swings between a roaring fire and a dead fire. The stone was breathing heat back into the room, a slow, steady exhalation that would last all night and into the next morning, long after the last ember in the stove was gray ash. The first snows came in November, soft and quiet. Jago moved his family into the Boulder just after the first hard freeze. The single room was furnished simply: 2 built-in stone shelves, a sturdy wooden bed for him and Morwenna, 2 smaller cots for the children, a table, and 4 chairs. The small stove sat near the center, its pipe rising to the fissure in the ceiling. The air smelled of clean stone, wood smoke, and Morwenna's cooking. The mockery from the quarrymen subsided into a watchful silence. The real test was coming. It arrived in the second week of January. A weather system, born over the Great Lakes, stalled over the Champlain Valley. For 3 days, it rained. But it was not rain. It was a super-cool deluge that froze the instant it touched any surface. The world was encased in a crystal shell. Every twig, every fence wire, every blade of dead grass wore an inch of clear, heavy ice. The weight was enormous. Ancient maples on the hillside groaned and then split apart with a sound like cannon fire. Travel became impossible. The world became a glittering, treacherous trap. Then, on the third night, the sky cleared and the temperature fell off a cliff. The mercury in Augustus Daly's thermometer on his porch shrank into its bulb. It dropped to 10 below, then 20. By dawn, it rested at 31 degrees below zero. An absolute murderous cold descended on Millstone Hill, a cold that found every weakness. Inside Silas Croft's well-built cabin, the war was being lost. Despite a stove glowing cherry red, the windows were opaque with a thick layer of feathery frost. A damp washcloth left near the wall was frozen into a solid plank. Silas and his wife took turns feeding the fire all night, their stockpile of seasoned hardwood vanishing at an alarming rate. Their children slept huddled together in the loft, wearing their coats and hats, their breath pluming in the frigid air. The very wood of the cabin groaned and popped in the intense cold, the nails shrinking in their holes, opening up 100 tiny new avenues for the cold to infiltrate. 400 yards away inside the granite boulder, a different reality prevailed. The temperature outside was 31 below zero. The temperature inside the chamber was a steady, quiet 64 degrees. Jago had run the stove for 6 hours the previous day. He had not added a single stick of wood since 10 o'clock the night before. There was no fire. There was only the immense, slow-breathing warmth of the stone. The air was perfectly still. There were no drafts. The only sound was the quiet breathing of his sleeping children. Morwenna, sitting at the table, was able to leave a small pat of butter on a dish. It remained soft and spreadable, a simple, profound luxury in the frozen world outside. This was the proof of normalcy. the quiet evidence that the cold had been utterly and completely defeated. On one of the stone shelves, Jago had left his wool work shirt to dry. He picked it up. It was bone-warm and pourable soft, the fabric pliant and welcoming. He could smell the faint, clean scent of the soap Morwenna had used. It was just a shirt. At the Croft cabin, an identical shirt hung on the back of a chair 10 feet from the stove was a board. Silas could have leaned it against the door. It was a shield, a piece of armor against the cold. Jago's was a garment. That was the difference. One family was surviving. The other was simply living. On the 4th day of the deep cold, there was an accident at the quarry. The intense temperature had made the stone brittle and unpredictable. A ledge that had been stable for 50 years suddenly gave way, sending a cascade of granite shards down into a lower pit. A young Italian quarryman, thankfully, was clear of the main fall, but his leg was badly broken by a smaller piece. Getting him down the ice-encased hill was a nightmare. That evening, as dusk settled and the temperature began its nightly plunge again, Augustus Daly knew he had a responsibility. As foreman, he had to go back up the hill and mark the unstable zones around the rockfall before the morning crew arrived. No one else could be trusted to read the signs of imminent failure. He pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped his face in wool, and began the treacherous walk up the slope, his lantern casting a small, dancing yellow light on the glazed, unreal landscape. The cold was a physical presence. It hurt to breathe. His eyelashes began to frost over. Every surface was coated in that thick, clear ice, gleaming under the rising moon. He made his way carefully, his boots crunching, marking the dangerous ledges with red chalk. His work done, he started back down, his route taking him past Jago Trevenna's boulder. He had heard nothing from the Cornishman in days. A part of him, a grim professional part, expected to see the great stone split in two, a testament to his own accurate prediction. He saw the boulder, a dark, hulking shape against the starlit snow. It looked inert, as frozen as everything else. But then he saw something impossible, something that broke the laws of this frozen world. Against the south face of the boulder, where the snow should have been deepest and the ice thickest, there was a patch of bare, dark ground. A perfect semicircle of thawed gravel, about 10 feet across, and rising from it, into the 30 below air were faint, unmistakable threads of steam. Daly stopped dead. He held his lantern up. It wasn't a trick of the light, the ground was wet. The ice that coated every other inch of the hillside stopped in a sharp line at the edge of this bare patch. His mind, the mind of a practical, experienced man, raced through the possibilities. A spring? No. Any spring would be frozen solid. A fire? Ridiculous. There was no smoke, no light. There was only one explanation. The heat was coming from the stone itself. The boulder was leaking warmth. The vast reservoir of heat stored within its core was radiating outward, not just into the living chamber, but through the 5-foot-thick outer shell, pushing back the colossal cold of the Vermont winter. It was a slow, gentle bleed of energy, but it was enough to melt a foot of snow and ice. It was enough to create a small island of thaw in an ocean of absolute frost. He walked closer, drawn by a force stronger than curiosity. It was the pull of undeniable truth. He expected to feel the biting cold radiating off the rock face, the way it did from any other ledge on the hill. He took off his thick mitten and reached out. What he expected was the sharp, painful cold of frozen granite. What he felt stopped his breath. His bare palm touched the stone, and it was not cold. It was not even neutral. It was warm, a deep, living warmth, a stored memory of a fire that was no longer burning. It was the feeling of a hearthstone hours after the flames have died. In that moment, Augustus Daly's world, a world built on a lifetime of assumptions about stone and cold and shelter, tilted on its axis. Jago Trevenna hadn't hairlined the boulder. He hadn't built a tomb. He had tamed a star and built a home in its core. He didn't knock on the door. He simply stood there for a long time, his bare hand pressed against the warm granite, feeling the steady, irrefutable pulse of a better idea. Word of Augustus Daly's conversion spread through the quarry sheds like a powder fuse. When the foreman, a man known for his rigid certainty, began telling people that the Cornishman's Boulder was the warmest damn place on the whole hill, the mockery stopped. It was replaced by a grudging, then a genuine curiosity. But the true engine of the idea's spread was not the foreman's endorsement. It was the quiet, trusted network of the Cornish Wesleyan Chapel. On Sundays after the main service, the Cornish families would gather for class meetings. They were small, intimate groups where they shared news from home, supported newcomers, and discussed the challenges of their new lives. It was here, in the basement of the small wooden chapel in Barre, that Jago Trevenna, at the urging of the circuit preacher, finally explained what he had done. He was not a boastful man. He didn't speak of physics or BTUs. He spoke of the kindness of the rock. He explained that if you heated it slowly, it would give the heat back slowly. He described how to read the seams to place the charges, how to chamber without cracking, how to respect the stone's nature. The men listened, not as they would to a foreman, but as they would to one of their own. They understood the language of the mine, of the lode, of the rock. They asked practical questions: how much powder, what angle for the drill holes, how long to burn the fire. Jago answered them all simply and directly. The news traveled along the chapel circuit, from Millstone Hill to the quarries in Websterville and Graniteville. It was a technology transfer that happened not in a journal or a patent office, but in murmured conversations over tea and saffron buns. By Easter, 3 other Cornish families, facing another winter in their own cold shacks, were out on their plots, searching not for a flat place to build a foundation, but for a solid, reliable boulder to make a home. What Jago Trevenna had done, using intuition and ancient craft, was to build a structure that would not be out of place in the most advanced architectural textbooks a century later. His boulder home was, in essence, a super-insulated, high-mass passive dwelling. Modern building science has given names to the principles he deployed: the Trombe wall, which uses a dark, massive wall to absorb solar energy and radiate it back at night; the principles of the passive house standard, which emphasizes air tightness and massive insulation. Jago had no solar gain, but he had a stove, and his 5 feet of granite was insulation on a scale modern builders can only dream of. He had created a shelter that didn't just resist the cold. It used its own mass to create a stable, comfortable microclimate, independent of the wild swings of the outside world. He was 100 years ahead of his time. There is a way of seeing the world that seeks to dominate it, to impose human will upon the landscape. This is the way of the axe, the saw, and the plumb line. It clears the forest, levels the ground, and erects a structure that stands in defiance of nature. It is a relationship of conquest. Jago Trevenna's work suggested a different path. He did not see the 40-foot boulder as an obstacle to be removed or a foundation to be built upon. He saw it as a vessel, a container of quiet, permanent strength. His entire craft was based on listening to the material, on understanding its internal logic, its inherent weaknesses and strengths. He did not build a house on the stone. He asked the stone if there was a room inside it. This was an act not of imposition, but of cooperation. He approached the granite not as a dead resource to be exploited, but as a powerful ally to be courted. And the stone, in return, gave his family a warmth and security that no wooden house on that frozen hill could ever provide. It was a shelter born of humility, patience, and a profound respect for the nature of things. Thank you for joining us on this journey back to Millstone Hill. If you found this story of ingenuity and forgotten wisdom valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of frontier innovation. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other historical technologies do you think deserve to be rediscovered? Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices and the physics of thermodynamics. The application of any building technique, historical or modern, should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.